Thanks for having me here today. I am going to be talking to you all about the financial realities of being autistic and why these realities mean that we have to have a different approach to managing our finances in a way that gives us self care. I, throughout my life, have struggled. I grew up poor and in poverty. And so I struggled financially coming into this world. And throughout a large part of my adult life, when I got out of college, I struggled to find employment and keep gainful employment because of being autistic. There's a lot of discrimination in the workforce. There's a lot of overstimulation, lack of accommodations, the job itself. The workplace is not very accommodating, in addition to the fact that there's a lot of biases in the interview process and, the job search process. And so the job market itself is not autistic friendly, needless to say, all of that. It is not autistic friendly to us. And so I've come to find that a 9 to 5 job, most of the workforce is not sustainable for me long term, because in society they say you should give a long-term career, stay at a workplace for 10 years plus in order to have your benefits, your retirement, all of that, to be able to invest and pay off debt and all of that. And so that is not sustainable for people like myself when we're dealing with workplace discrimination, workplace lack of workplace accommodations, and a workforce that tends to lead us to burnout quickly. That's not sustainable for us. And so what I've learned throughout my own struggle with finding and keeping employment, and every time I would get a job, I would either lose it due to unspoken biases, or I would lose it due to being burnt out, overworking, and then lead myself to burnout. So either way, I would never keep a job once I got it. And all of that did was teach me that I need to have a unique strategy when it comes to managing my money and when it comes to being able to make sure that I'm secure. And this approach is going to look differently than it does for my neurotypical peers, because I have unique challenges, when it comes to being in the workforce. And so one of the things I've learned was that being autistic, having these struggles, I have to somehow figure out some passive income. And for me, that ended up looking like starting my own business. I rented out my cars for passive income, something that didn't burn me out too much, something that was low bandwidth. And I did not have to interact with a lot of overstimulating stressors while I was doing that as well. And albeit that came with its own risk, but it was still a source of income that was low bandwidth, and it allowed me to still be able to support myself. And another thing that I started doing was content creating, getting on YouTube, writing books on Amazon. And speaking of which, I have a book that's on Amazon. The passive income from royalties and being a content creator. The whole idea is to have income that's very low bandwidth and something that can sustain you without you being reliant on an ableist job market, or a job market that requires too much of your mental bandwidth and for you to burn yourself out. Don't be reliant on a job market that's not for you. That's the whole point of having passive income streams and being able to build wealth outside of the 9 to 5 job. And so I poured all my energy into that, doing content, making my own creations, making my own books, and, starting my own side businesses, things like that. And another thing that I've had to learn to do was also manage my lifestyle in a way that does not rely on me to work 9 to 5. And so because I know that I'm very inconsistent, a 9 to 5 tends to be a very inconsistent and unsustainable option for me. That means I can't do what, the status quo typically dictates that you have. Like I already know that a mortgage is out of the question, car notes, excessive spending like on luxuries, debt, credit card, consumer spending and all of that I have to keep all of that to a minimum, because I know that this is not sustainable for me. It's better for me to either save up to pay for what it is I want, do as much as I can in cash. And if I do have to use a credit card, because let's face it, for a lot of us, a credit card is realistically the only option. So the best way to deal with a credit card is, to spend on it for our needs and then make payments as flexible as we can. Don't, I guess what I'm trying to say is a credit card is not as much of a commitment. It's not as much of a large chunk of a commitment as, say, a car note is or a mortgage is. It's a little more flexible and the payments are a little, lower. So if I'm having a moment where I'm burnt out and I can't do a lot of high bandwidth work, then I can make flexible arrangements to pay on my credit card for something that I may need, like my medication. And so these are tactics that I use to kind of maneuver the financial situations and challenges that present themselves to those of us who cannot adhere to the typical 9 to 5. That's something that I personally do. I know how to, you know, maneuver the statement balance, pay that off as much as I can and have my payments be flexible, in moments where I can't pay it all, but I need that flexibility to be able to pay off a small amount. And another thing I do is I really am mindful of my spending. So I really think twice about, do I really need this item? Do I really want this item? Is this item, am I honestly going to get a lot of use out of it? Am I honestly going to like it in a few months? Because if that's the case, then I leave it on the shelf, and then that's just money that I keep to sustain me, for the foreseeable future. And so these are the choices that I had to make being autistic and dealing with the realities of the workplace. These are choices that I have to make that my peers don't necessarily have to make. And so the thing about being autistic is we have to make sure that we're good, as far as our finances. We have to make sure that we're secure. We have to make sure that we get our needs met, because we cannot depend on the ableist workplace. We cannot depend on ableist systems to have our back. So we have to have our own back. And another thing that I want to talk to you guys about is, if you need to, social safety nets are okay to get. And there's a lot of shame around getting things like Social Security, SNAP benefits, housing vouchers. There's a lot of shame around that. And a lot of us grew up feeling like we're lazy if we have to rely on these things, or we're a failure, or, we've burnt out from working and then we simply can't maintain work anymore and we need to fall back on these. Somehow we internalize that as a moral failing. And if we can get past the shame around that and the stigma around that, then those can be really helpful sources to us as well, to help us navigate these periods of time where we need to really invest in our self-care. And we need to focus on what we need versus working for a corporation. Because there are going to be times, a lot of us deal with periods of time where we either work really hard and then we don't take care of ourselves, or we just completely burn out of working and we still can't take care of ourselves. And so those are not sustainable in the long run. So there comes a point where we will have to have some sort of balance. And that means sometimes you're going to have to put your needs first before working, which means you will have to have ways to maneuver around all of these. And benefits, social programs come into play to help us fill in that gap that comes in when we're unable to work, but we need to start being able to take care of ourselves, our physical health, our physical needs, all of that. And lastly, I want to talk about the system, how predatory the system is when it comes to us being neurodivergent and things like late fees, overdraft fees, things of that nature. The financial system, if you deal with executive dysfunction at all, or you deal with ADHD, sometimes it's really hard to manage your finances in a way that does not trigger these fees from happening. Sometimes you'll accidentally pay a bill late, or you'll overextend yourself on your checking account and end up with an overdraft fee, which I think they're so predatory and should be illegal, because how are you charging fees on accounts when people have no money, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's just corporate greed, but that's a whole nother conversation. So the best way that I think we should manage these is I think auto pay is really helpful. If you're someone who struggles with executive function and being able to organize when your bills are due, auto pay is very helpful, but the caveat with that is you have to have consistent income. The income has to be consistent and predictable for it to work. Otherwise, it can also trigger an overdraft fee. To which I say that the best solution to that is to get you a bank without an overdraft fee. Capital One's a good bank. Truist is a good bank if you're in the area. There's a lot of banks now that are doing without overdraft fees, and so I suggest finding one of those. And so lastly, I would also like to focus on our special interests, us being able to engage in our special interests. So, me personally, I like to travel. Exploring the world, exploring the globe is my special interest. And so, that's another way that I take care of myself. I make sure that I have money and I make sure that I'm able to engage in the thing that brings me joy and that brings out the best in me being autistic. And so that may mean, like I said earlier, not participating in social functions, for instance, because a lot of social functions that are in my life personally, they come with pressure to spend money. So let's say that you're having a friend who has a wedding, you're having family events, family reunions, and there's all this pressure to buy clothes, buy drinks, buy this, buy that. I say no to those things, even if that means that the people around me may think that I'm being, stubborn, or they may think whatever they want to think. I say no to that regardless of how the people around me feel about it, because I'm thinking about my goal of being able to indulge in my special interest, which is travel. And your special interests may be different than mine, but the point is I have to be able to do what it takes to bring myself joy. And so if that means I have to make temporary sacrifices to make that happen, then that's what I'm gonna do. And again, also creating a life around what brings me joy. So being able to have a flexible life where I don't rely on a traditional 9 to 5 makes it easier for me to get the travel because I have more flexibility now. And not to mention having multiple sources of passive income makes that easier to be able to travel. And of course, there's the financing, aspect of it too that can be flexible. And as long as you don't take out too many loans, or if you don't get in over your head, it can actually be a good option to be able to travel and be able to see the world or do whatever it is that brings you joy. In that case, it's travel, but for you, it may look like collecting Legos or something. But the point is, we have to put ourselves first. We cannot be putting our needs last to benefit corporations, because at the end of the day, that's what we're being asked to do. We're being asked to sacrifice so much of us, and it already costs those of us with autism. It already costs so much of us for us just to show up, to work, just to show up for family and friends. Like, showing up for us already costs so much, and for them to ask us to put our health on the back burner, to sacrifice our mental well-being, to even put ourselves on the brink of financial ruin just to maintain a job or maintain, certain status quo credit obligations. It's just not worth it. And so there are going to be times when you're going to have to put yourself first before a job, before creditors, before material gain, right? That's just the reality of it. And my other point that I want to bring up as well is when it comes to dealing with, if you fall and hit a rough patch, let's say that you haven't had income for a while, you're unable to earn income for a while, and you end up not being able to pay your creditors, you're not able to pay your bills. There's always the option to negotiate the bills. You can, whenever you do get money in the future, if your income is not consistent and it's up and down, you can always settle the bills, especially credit cards, for much less. You can opt sometimes to not pay them and negotiate them to get them off of your credit report. You can even opt for a affordable payment plan. A lot of credit cards and, creditors have hardship payment plans as well. And when it comes to things like medical debt, which a lot of us deal with, there are programs out there that we as taxpayers pay into these hospital tax funds so that we can have access to financial assistance programs that they have. So if you ever go to the hospital and you don't have insurance, for instance, you can ask and inquire about a financial assistance program. And a lot of times they'll wipe the bill out for free. Like, they'll completely wipe you clean of the bill, and they may offer you access to primary care, during that period of the financial assistance. So this is a good option for people who are in that middle range where they don't qualify for Medicaid, but they also don't have insurance or consistent employment. So that's an option to look at as well. But basically, the whole idea is it's not the end of the world, because the thing about being autistic is that we tend to be very rigid. I know me personally, I'm very rigid when it comes to paying my bills on time, the creditor says I have to pay this amount, and then I get really stressed out because I can't. Or sometimes we beat up on ourselves when, we have these plans to pay things off and get rid of a debt or something like that, and then it doesn't happen. It causes us to get really hard on ourselves and beat up on ourselves, especially when it's like an interruption in your routine. When you have a routine of paying things and then all of a sudden you can't, it causes an interruption. And that can cause us to spiral. And so just understand there are options for that. And I personally had to learn the hard way that there are options, to maneuver this stuff, and that it's not the end of the world. If we ever can't pay something, it's not the end of the world, and it's not the end of us. But overall, the whole point of all of this is so that we can take care of ourselves financially, and we don't neglect our own needs and don't neglect ourselves in the name of the status quo. It's called self-care financially, looking out for our artistic needs before we focus on what the status quo says we should do. And finally, I'm going to make this point about financial advice, how most financial advice fails us as autistic people. Most financial advice assumes that you don't deal with burnout very easily. It assumes that you're able to hold a 9-to-5, or that you're going to have an easy time getting a 9-to-5 and keeping it. Most financial advice also tends to assume that you grew up with privilege, which many of us have not. And so when you hear a lot of traditional financial advice, it doesn't take these things into account. It takes into account people who, it almost assumes that you're a robot when it's telling you to work multiple jobs, work all these side hustles just to pay off a bill or just to, make ends meet. Traditional financial advice doesn't even treat you like a human. It treats you more like a robot that doesn't have needs, like a machine that can just keep working yourself into the grave. And it's not sustainable. And that is where personal finance advice tends to fail. It's not sustainable for most people, especially us, because it doesn't take into consideration the fact that a lot of us also have co-occurring diseases, co-occurring conditions that require that are expensive to manage in this healthcare system. And not only do we have the realities in the job market that we're working up against, we also have our health working against us as well. And so financial advice does not take that into consideration too, which is why I'm here doing this work, to let you guys know that there are other options that they don't talk about. Thank you so much for having me here. And it was my pleasure sharing all this with you.